The showers in the barracks were supposed to be a place of routine, a space where soldiers washed off the sweat and grime of long, punishing days. But that night, the air was different. Steam rose thick and heavy, making the fluorescent lights blur into hazy shapes. She stood under the running water, her posture straight even in such vulnerability, as though she carried discipline in her very bones. The mocking voices started soft at first, just whispers exchanged between men who thought themselves braver than they were. Soon, though, the whispers grew into laughter, cruel and cutting, echoing off the tiled walls in a chorus of arrogance. They came closer, steps deliberate, circling her as though she were prey and they were hunters. The sound of dripping water mixed with the scuff of boots on wet tile, a rhythm of intimidation designed to remind her of where she was and how outnumbered she seemed. She felt their eyes on her, scanning her, trying to strip away dignity as much as the uniform that was absent in this moment. They had mistaken silence for weakness, calmness for submission, stillness for fear. Their words were sharp, laced with derision. They taunted her, questioned her presence, mocked the very idea that someone like her belonged in their space. One of them laughed louder than the rest, stepping in closer, pointing at her as though she were a spectacle rather than a soldier. The others followed his lead, emboldened by the numbers that surrounded her. In their minds, they had already won. She was outnumbered, exposed, with nothing but the steam to shield her from their stares. But what they didn't understand was that she didn't need shielding. Every movement she made, every breath she took, was calculated, measured, disciplined. She had been trained to control her body, her mind, and her emotions under pressures far greater than this. She had faced enemies with weapons, ambushes in the dead of night, and terrains designed to kill. Compared to those missions, this room of arrogant voices was nothing but noise. Still, the humiliation was real, not because of their words or their laughter, but because of the utter ignorance that filled the space. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't see the years of sacrifice etched into her muscles, the scars hidden beneath her skin, or the unspoken authority she carried from leading men into situations that demanded more courage than any of them had shown in their lives. All they saw was a woman alone in the showers, and they mistook that image for weakness. The circle tightened. She could feel the warmth of their bodies through the steam, hear the sneers grow sharper, the words heavier. They thought they had taken her dignity, but in truth, they had only exposed their own. One leaned in too close, his voice a low challenge meant to provoke a reaction. The others waited, watching her face for any sign of fear, any flinch, any twitch of the eyes that would give them the satisfaction of victory. But her eyes remained steady, calm, focused. They burned with something they could not name, something that unsettled even as they tried to laugh louder to drown it out. The air grew heavier, the steam thicker, the tension almost tangible. It was a moment suspended between humiliation and revelation, between arrogance and downfall. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to move. Her silence was not submission, it was strength. They had no idea the storm that lay coiled beneath her calm exterior, no idea the identity of the woman they were mocking, no idea of the commander who had led Navy SEALs through the gates of hell itself and returned stronger. The mocking voices carried on, but the truth was already waiting beneath the surface, ready to shatter everything they thought they knew about her, about power, about fear. The laughter slowly began to fade, not because they had chosen to stop, but because silence pressed itself into the room like an invisible weight. The thick steam still swirled around them, wrapping every figure in an eerie haze, yet through it, her eyes cut sharp and steady. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She didn't show the slightest sign of discomfort. Instead, she stood completely still, water streaming down her face, her shoulders held firm, her posture unshaken. That silence was louder than their insults had ever been. It demanded their attention without her saying a single word. Her calmness was unnerving, though none of them would admit it. Men who had laughed only moments before now found themselves shuffling slightly, shifting their weight from one foot to the other. It was not the reaction they expected. They had cornered her, mocked her, reduced her down to an object of their cruelty, and yet, she didn't respond like prey. Her eyes, cold and calculating, met theirs one by one. She didn't glare. She didn't break. She looked at them the way a hunter looks at animals, making too much noise in the dark. Inside, her mind was alive with calculation. Every detail of the room registered. The slippery floor, the distance between her and the one who stood closest, the nervous shifting of another who was pretending to be bold. She could smell the faint metallic tang of the water mixing with sweat, hear the echo of drops striking tile, measure the rhythm of their breathing against the heavy quiet that had now descended. She didn't panic. She assessed. They thought she was trapped, but in truth, they were the ones caged. The showers, with their tiled walls and narrow space, offered them nowhere to run if things changed. She knew it. She felt it. And for the first time, so did they, though they didn't yet understand why unease was crawling under their skin. One soldier laughed again, though the sound cracked halfway, not carrying the same confidence as before. He tried to fill the silence, to drown out the tension that had grown unbearable, but even he couldn't keep his voice steady. His eyes flicked to hers, and in that brief exchange, his laughter faltered completely. What he saw staring back at him wasn't fear. It was control, authority, something that didn't belong to someone cornered, but to someone who held every advantage without needing to move an inch. Her breathing was steady, her chest rising and falling with the kind of control that only years of discipline could bring. She remembered deserts under scorching suns, nights spent awake in swamps so dark that even the stars were hidden, missions where a single mistake meant death for not just herself but the team that followed her. Compared to those nights, this moment was nothing, and yet, she knew it was everything. How she responded now would define the line between weakness and power, between being dismissed as a victim and being recognized as something far greater. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't speak. She let the silence suffocate them, let the weight of her composure press harder than any scream or struggle ever could. It was a tactic she had used before, not in showers, but in interrogation rooms, in standoffs, in moments where words meant less than presence. People always underestimated stillness, not realizing it was often the most dangerous weapon of all. The soldiers around her began to shift again. The circle was still tight, but their stance had changed. Where before they leaned in with arrogance, now their posture was hesitant, cautious, as though they weren't entirely sure what they were dealing with anymore. Their eyes still scanned her, but now they lingered not on her vulnerability, but on her strength. Something about the way she carried herself, even now, was beginning to feel wrong to them, as though they had missed a crucial detail. One of them whispered something, but it didn't carry. The others ignored it, though a nervous energy rippled through the group. They had wanted her to react, to cower, to lash out, to give them something they could laugh about later. Instead, they were left with the unbearable weight of her silence and the sharp edge of her calm gaze. The quiet deepened, pressing against them harder with each second that passed. She knew it wouldn't last forever. At some point, someone would notice what they all had overlooked. For now, though, she let the silence stretch, let it expose their insecurities, let it remind them that they were not in control the way they thought. It happened in an instant, so fast that most of them didn't even realize what had shifted until it was too late. One of the soldiers, the one who had been watching her more closely than the others, suddenly froze. His eyes weren't locked on her face or her posture, but on her shoulder. The steam had shifted just enough. The water had rolled down her skin in just the right way, and the ink that had been hidden now revealed itself. His voice faltered, his expression tightened, and though he said nothing at first, the way his eyes widened was enough to change the air in the room. The others didn't notice at first. They were still feeding off their own arrogance, chuckling quietly, trying to push the silence away with small, nervous gestures. But he saw it clearly. The tattoo wasn't decorative. It wasn't some random mark that soldiers wore for pride. This one was different, distinct, something only a select few ever carried. The sharp lines, the symbol etched into her skin, the unmistakable insignia of a Navy SEAL commander. He knew it because he had seen it before, not on himself, not on anyone in his unit, but in stories told in hushed voices, in whispered legends about the few who bore it and the authority it carried. For a moment, he wanted to look away, to convince himself that maybe he had been mistaken, but the truth glared back at him with undeniable clarity. That symbol was real, and it was staring him in the face, etched permanently into the shoulder of the very woman they had thought to humiliate. The blood drained from his face as he took half a step back, his boots squeaking against the wet tile. The others caught the movement and turned toward him, confused. Their laughter faltered, replaced by puzzled glances. He didn't speak, not yet. He just pointed, slowly, his finger trembling slightly as he directed their attention toward her shoulder. One by one, their eyes followed, narrowing through the haze, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. And then, when the steam shifted again and the symbol became clear to all, silence consumed them completely. The shift was palpable. Where only moments ago they had seen her as powerless, now they realized the depth of their mistake. That ring of arrogance around her crumbled, replaced by the heavy weight of recognition. Their faces changed, some pale with shock, others hardened in disbelief, a few still trying to deny what their eyes confirmed. But there was no denying it. That insignia was not a decoration anyone could claim. It belonged to the few, the elite, the ones whose names were spoken with both respect and fear in every corner of the military. Her eyes never moved, never wavered. She saw the recognition settle in, saw the way their bodies stiffened, the way their breathing hitched as the reality sank deeper. She didn't need to explain. The tattoo said everything. It told them about her past, about the missions she had led, about the kind of authority she carried even when stripped of uniform, even when surrounded, even when mocked. She was not their equal. She was their superior, in every sense of the word. One soldier swallowed hard, the sound loud in the suffocating silence. Another took a step back, bumping into the wall as if to put space between himself and the truth that stood in the center of the circle. The leader of their taunting, the one who had laughed the loudest, clenched his jaw and forced his eyes away, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. They were no longer looking at someone they thought they could break. They were staring at someone who had the power to shatter them all with a single command. Recognition rippled through the group like a wave, unstoppable and undeniable. Their arrogance had blinded them, but now that blindness was gone, and in its place was the cold realization of who they had dared to confront. They weren't circling a victim in the showers. They had surrounded a Navy SEAL commander, a leader who had walked through fire, survived ambushes, and carried men through death's door only to bring them back alive. That one mark on her shoulder was more than a tattoo. It was a declaration of everything she was, everything she had done, and everything she was capable of. It silenced the room more effectively than any weapon could. And as they stared at it, they knew their laughter had cost them more than they ever could have imagined. The moment the insignia revealed itself, everything inside the shower shifted. What had been a cruel game of power suddenly turned into a crushing silence that no one dared to break. The arrogance that had filled the air evaporated, replaced by the sharp bite of fear that crept into the soldiers' eyes. They weren't staring at a woman they could ridicule anymore. They were staring at a leader, a commander, a force that carried with her not just authority, but the weight of something far more dangerous. Respect earned in blood, in war, in battles most of them had only heard about in whispers. The reversal was almost physical, as though the ground itself had tilted beneath them. She hadn't moved, not a single inch, but now every man in that circle felt cornered. Their mocking voices had vanished. Their bravado collapsed under the simple truth revealed by that tattoo. For the first time, they realized the danger wasn't her being outnumbered. It was them, caught in their ignorance, facing someone who had led warriors far tougher than they could ever dream of being. One soldier's chest rose and fell too fast, his breath shallow, betraying the unease he was trying desperately to mask. Another's eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet her gaze anymore. And the one who had been so loud, so certain of his dominance, now clenched his fists, not in strength but in nervousness, because he knew there was no undoing what they had already done. They had mocked their commander. They had humiliated someone who had earned honors they couldn't begin to comprehend. She didn't need to speak, didn't need to issue a single order. The silence that followed was louder than any command. It crushed them under its weight, forcing them to face the truth of their actions. Her eyes remained steady, unflinching, carrying that calm authority that needed no explanation. It was the kind of authority born in fire, the kind that came from years of leading men into battles where survival was never guaranteed. They could see it now, clear as day. in the way she held herself even when stripped of everything but her presence. The fear spread quickly. It wasn't the wild panic of facing immediate danger. It was the cold, suffocating kind of fear that comes when someone realizes they've crossed a line they never should have touched. It was the weight of knowing their arrogance had placed them in the position of offenders, and that the person standing in the center wasn't just capable of punishing them. She had the power to end their careers, their reputations, their sense of belonging in a single stroke. For the first time since stepping into the showers, their eyes avoided her not out of disrespect, but out of shame. The bravado had been stripped away, and in its place, unease took hold. They shifted their feet, adjusted their posture, tried to find some comfort in the heavy air, but none came. The reversal of power had been too complete, too absolute. One soldier opened his mouth as if to say something, maybe to excuse, maybe to apologize, but the words never came. The weight in the room crushed his voice before it could form. Another swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously, a subtle sign of the fear he couldn't control. The colonel's stories about SEAL commanders, the legends that drifted through the military, all began to make sense now. They were staring at one of those legends, and they had treated her like she was nothing. Her silence remained unbroken, but in that silence was the unspoken message that hit them harder than any shouted words could have. They had underestimated her. They had disrespected her. And in doing so, they had revealed their own weakness, their own lack of discipline, their own failure to recognize the kind of strength that stood in front of them. The reversal was complete. Fear no longer belonged to her. It was theirs now, heavy and undeniable, pressing into their chests with every breath. They were no longer predators circling prey. They were soldiers caught in the undeniable presence of their commander, stripped bare not of clothes, but of arrogance, forced to confront the reality that they had mocked someone who could command not just a room, but entire missions where lives depended on her decisions. The silence lingered like a blade suspended in the air, and with every passing second the weight of it pressed heavier on their shoulders. The mocking grins were gone, the laughter extinguished, replaced by tight jaws and shifting feet as reality settled in. What began as arrogance had turned into unease, and unease into shame. The reversal had been swift, but the consequences were beginning to take shape in a way none of them could escape. It started with the colonel. His eyes, which had first glared with authority and expectation, now softened into something else entirely, recognition. He saw in her what the others had failed to see, what their arrogance had blinded them to. His gaze lingered on the insignia, then lifted slowly to meet her eyes. In that single exchange, respect was born, not the kind that comes from rank on paper, but the kind that comes from witnessing true strength. He gave a slight nod, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough for her to understand. He knew, he respected, and he would remember. The other soldiers, those who had formed the circle of mockery, now found themselves standing awkwardly in place, their bravado crumbling. Their shoulders slumped slightly, their eyes darting between her and the colonel as if waiting for some instruction, some direction on how to act now that the truth was undeniable. But no one spoke. No one dared. The shame of their behavior had sunk too deep. They could feel it like heat rising from the floor, burning through the fragile shields of their pride. One soldier, the same one who had laughed the loudest, finally dropped his gaze. His voice cracked as he muttered something under his breath, not loud enough to be clear, but the tone was heavy with regret. Another shifted his weight back, leaning slightly against the wall, his expression no longer smug but hollow, as if realizing for the first time how foolish he had been. The sound of running water filled the room, every drop echoing the truth they couldn't run from. She hadn't said a word, but her presence had demanded it all. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't moved a muscle, but she had taken control of the room in a way none of them had expected. Respect wasn't given lightly in the military. It was earned through scars, through sacrifice, through the kind of leadership that only came when others trusted you with their lives. And in that moment, they realized she had earned more respect than any of them could ever hope to. The colonel straightened his back, his posture no longer tense with anger, but firm with acknowledgement. He turned his eyes briefly toward the others, a silent warning that their behavior had been not just shameful, but unacceptable. The soldiers felt the weight of his unspoken judgment, and in their own silence, they lowered their heads. Their arrogance had been stripped bare, and all that remained was submission, not to a victim, but to a leader. The shame was almost unbearable for them. They had treated her as less, when in truth she was more. They had tried to humiliate her, but instead revealed their own ignorance. Their faces told the story clearly, wide eyes clouded with regret, lips pressed tight to hold back apologies they couldn't find the courage to voice. They stood in that steam-filled room, not as men in power, but as men humbled by the weight of authority they hadn't seen until it was too late. And in that humbling came respect. Not forced, not demanded, but earned. Earned in the stillness of her gaze, in the calm authority she carried without needing to prove it, in the undeniable truth etched on her skin and in her history. They respected her now not because they were told to, but because they had no choice. Because respect wasn't just about recognizing rank. It was about recognizing greatness when it stood in front of you, unshaken, unmoved, and undeniable. The room was different now. The power had shifted completely. The soldiers no longer looked at her with mockery, but with reverence, the kind of reverence that comes only when pride collapses under the weight of truth. The colonel's nod had sealed it. The air that once rang with laughter now pulsed with respect, heavy and unspoken, but real. The silence did not fade. It grew thicker, pressing against every wall, every breath, until it became impossible to ignore. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. The soldiers who once thought themselves untouchable now felt the weight of their own insignificance crushing them. It wasn't simply embarrassment anymore. It was something deeper, something they couldn't shake even if they tried. They had been confronted with a truth that stripped away every layer of arrogance they had built for themselves. In the military, power wasn't about rank alone, and they now understood that she embodied a power far greater than any of them had imagined. She stood tall, calm, unflinching. Her posture was unyielding, but her silence was louder than anything words could have offered. It wasn't silence born of fear, but silence born of discipline, silence that spoke of battles fought in places they could never imagine, silence that told the story of nights where survival depended not on talk, but on action. That silence commanded more authority than the loudest of orders. It left them all unsettled because they knew, deep down, that it came from experience they could never match. The colonel's eyes didn't leave her. He had seen countless soldiers in his life, men and women who carried medals, scars, and burdens alike. But rarely had he seen someone who could quiet a room with nothing more than her presence. He could see the history in her eyes, the discipline, the scars, the resilience. It was more than respect now. It was recognition of a peer, perhaps even a superior in ways that didn't appear on paper. He gave her another subtle nod, a second acknowledgement, this time less for her and more for the others to see. His gesture was deliberate, a message that left no room for doubt. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably, their bravado fully shattered. A few tried to meet her eyes, but none could hold the gaze. They saw something there that unsettled them. Not just authority, but the weight of someone who had stared death in the face and refused to break. One by one, they dropped their stares, retreating into themselves, wrestling with their own shame. They had reduced her to an object of ridicule, only to learn she was the kind of person who had earned her place through the most grueling trials the world could offer. That realization left them exposed, raw, and deeply unsettled. The steam still rose around them, the sound of running water echoing in the background, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What had once been a place of casual cruelty had become a chamber of reckoning. Every soldier in the room felt it. The quiet humiliation of being in the presence of someone greater than themselves. Their earlier laughter now seemed grotesque, a sound that would echo in their minds long after they left that place, a reminder of how quickly arrogance could turn into regret. She didn't gloat, didn't move to seize the moment, didn't speak a word to humiliate them in return. She didn't need to. Her silence was victory, her composure their undoing. In that, she displayed the very essence of leadership, the ability to command without force, to inspire respect without demanding it, to rise above pettiness and prove authority through restraint. That kind of strength couldn't be taught in classrooms or manuals. It had to be lived, earned through trials, through sacrifice, through pain. They understood that now, though too late to erase their shame. The colonel finally broke the stillness with a sharp inhale, a sound that echoed like a signal in the silence. He adjusted his stance, shoulders squared, eyes narrowed at the men around him. His look was a warning, an unspoken condemnation of their behavior. Without a word, he made it clear that what had happened would not be forgotten, that their actions had not only disrespected her, but disrespected the uniform itself. The weight of his silent judgment crushed them even further, forcing them deeper into their own guilt. Her eyes swept the room once more, not with malice, not with triumph, but with steady calm. Each man felt it. The way her gaze seemed to pierce through their defenses, leaving them stripped bare of excuses. They realized that they hadn't just disrespected her, they had disrespected themselves. They had revealed their weakness, their inability to recognize true strength when it stood before them. And now they were left with the bitter taste of regret, knowing they would never regain the ground they had lost in that moment. The respect that filled the room wasn't spoken, but it was undeniable. It clung to the air like the steam, seeping into every corner, heavy and inescapable. They all knew that things would never be the same after this. She had changed the balance of the room without lifting a hand, without speaking a word, and that was something they would carry with them long after the showers had gone cold.